Good morning, everyone. Foggy Mondays, and welcome to the News Agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox, and the Mirror's political editor, Pippa Crerar. Welcome to the glorious new post-Trump world in which there's still Brexit, still a pandemic, and still quite a worrying amount of Donald Trump. Through it all, we want you to ask us your questions, ask us whatever is on your mind, and we'll do our best to answer them for you. So what have we got today? Well, if you read the Daily Mirror, which you should be doing, you will see that NH staff are completely exhausted just when we need them to strain their sinews again, and they need a pay rise. Nicola has been accused of not being homosexual enough on Strictly. And it turns out that we're related to rats, which isn't really that much of a surprise if you think about it. But first, there's a new boy in town. His name's Joe Biden, a part Irish, honest man who quite likes the Good Friday Agreement and the rule of law, whose country can get a deal with the biggest single market on earth without having to use the UK as a conduit to the EU. And all this presents Boris Johnson with a bit of a problem, doesn't it, Pippa? How's he going to cope with that?
It's going to be a tricky start to the relationship, that's for sure. I mean, Boris Johnson, as I'm sure you'll all remember, was quite critical of Joe Biden's former boss, Barack Obama. Said some comments about his part Kenyan heritage, which of course he's not part.
Ancestral dislike, wasn't it? Ancestral dislike of the UK.
It was a row over Winston Churchill's bust being removed from the Oval Office, but it was seen as being racist by the Obama administration at the time, and of course Joe Biden was not just the vice president but a very close friend, and that is definitely sort of really sullied the relationship up until this point. And also, don't forget that Donald Trump described Boris Johnson as Britain Trump. And the US media has made much of the fact that there are similarities in that they both have been sort of fairly sort of populist leaders. They're both not afraid of sort of, maybe being flexible with the truth to get what they want. And they both have sort of embarked on quite big political projects. In Boris Johnson's case, obviously Brexit. So up until this point, there's been a degree of concern in Number 10 about how the beginning of that relationship would go should Joe Biden win. And Boris Johnson hasn't met Joe Biden. It's the first example we've got of a sitting prime minister not meeting and not having met a new president for many, many years up until this point. And of course, Joe Biden's going to start taking the phone calls, and we're not expecting Boris Johnson to be top of the list. However, I should say that Joe Biden is a long-standing, experienced political Washington operator. And whatever his personal views may be of Boris Johnson and his concerns, very sincerely held concerns over the fate of the Irish border as a result of the government's Brexit plans, he nevertheless will recognise that this is an old, long-standing relationship, that Britain is a close ally, regardless of who's in charge. And he will also recognise that part of Boris Johnson's cozying up to Donald Trump was the fact that Trump was president at the time. And Boris Johnson made a political decision to get himself on the right side, as far as he regarded it, and sort of flatter the ego of the outgoing president. Other European leaders obviously took a different view and stood up to him on some of his more controversial measures and plans and things that he said. So I think while it's going to be a bumpy start, I think it's inevitable that conversations will happen. And as we go on, I think it's quite clear that the Americans will be the grown-ups here, and we reach out to Britain, and the relationship will be longer term. Brexit aside, actually, not that bad.
Yeah, countries do tend to, well, the grown-ups that run countries do tend to realise that they're dealing with the country via their current leader, whoever that might be. Now, Jamie asked, why isn't Donald Trump allowed back in the White House? Because it's for Biden. Yeah. Thanks, Jamie. Keep working at it. Try some more. What have you got there, Pippa?
I've got my Biden Harris hat, which I've been wearing since the results since the election day, and also it took us about 4 days to get to the result. I also have one of these. See which way it goes.
Covering every possible base there. Typical political editor. Well done. Now, Kevin Maguire in the Mirror today says that Kamala Harris hates Boris Johnson even more than Joe Biden might do. Now, Theresa May was the ninth, once Trump took office on January the 20th, 4 years ago, Theresa May was the ninth leader rung by Trump. says Kevin Maguire, and he reckons that Boris won't even make the first dozen. But as you said earlier on, surely, toes are reaching out across the water to try to make contact and test the camp on the other side. There will be communication happening between Boris's lot and Joe's lot already, won't they? They won't just be waiting for that call, surely.
Yeah. And Dominic Raab was around the weekend saying that he and the British ambassador, Karen Pierce, in Washington, are already sort of reaching out to the Biden administration. And of course, don't forget that Joe Biden banned any of his team from making contact, sort of sitting down and having discussions with any international partners in the run up to the election, because he wanted to make sure that there wasn't sort of any openings for claims of, for example, Russian influence, which have overshadowed previous elections in the States. So, everyone, not just Britain, is going at this from a standing start. Also, Donald Trump, when it came to putting in his calls, there was kind of sort of a pecking order. Britain hoped to be close to the top. Not only was there not a pecking order, but it was absolutely random. I think Britain found out, Theresa May found out that the presidents of Turkey and Egypt, big international players, but not necessarily the ones that you'd expect to be top of the list, had called Donald Trump on his mobile, and it actually ended up having to be sort of done by a very informal process, because the transition team that Donald Trump had set up to deal with the international affairs side of things all got sacked, because that was his want, that kind of sort of thing he did. So this time around, I think it's going to be much more predictable. There's going to be a much more sort of, our people in Washington and indeed at the Foreign Office at number 10 will probably have a better idea of what to expect. It'll be much more sticking to convention. But I think it's fair to say that there will be we probably expect that Joe Biden won't shy away from making a point about which leaders he speaks to first. And crucially, in Europe, Britain is almost sort of like, has had a warning shot fired by the Biden administration on its Brexit plans, in particular the internal markets bill going through the Lords today, which is basically going to decide how the four nations of the UK trade with each other, between each other and with the EU after Brexit. There's some controversial clauses in that, which critics and Joe Biden fear puts the border in Northern Ireland at risk Northern Ireland peace, and could be a problem for the Good Friday Agreement. And I would be very surprised if he didn't, in that first phone call with Boris Johnson, mention that, and possibly make a point by speaking to, in the first instance, Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron and other European leaders, and possibly when he comes to visit, when we get to that point, coming to Brussels first rather than London. It really wouldn't surprise me whether he would sort of put Britain on warning, if you like, that they need to be very careful about how they handle the Good Friday Agreement. Obviously, Biden's got Irish heritage, feels very strongly about it. Boris Johnson, on the other hand, and number 10, are going to be really focusing on the things that they do have in common. And the Prime Minister said yesterday, we've more in common than that which divides us, which is probably true overall as countries, if not as individual administrations. And climate change seems to be the thing that the government is really grasping onto just now. Britain is hosting the COP26 climate summit next year in Glasgow, and that's obviously going to be a big moment for us to show our leadership. Biden said that they'll sign back up to the Paris Agreement when he becomes president. So, that's common ground.
Yeah, and as Sahar asked there, what's his new relationship going to be with the Middle East? Because the UK is also chairing the G7 next year, aren't we? So there's going to be lots of opportunity for Britain to be at the top table and being part of all this stuff. The issue is whether, Boris Johnson is trusted.
Well, absolutely. And I think, I would be hugely surprised if Biden decides to run his Middle East peace process, his Middle East relations, rather, through Britain and the G7 rather than doing it bilaterally. I did think it was really interesting that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, still had, after the result was, it was accepted that Biden had won the presidential election, still had it on his Twitter feed, even when congratulating Biden and Kamala Harris, a picture of himself with Donald Trump. Of course, they were incredibly close. The relationship between Israel and the United States is sort of one of the deepest out there. And as we all know, it proved controversial under Donald Trump. Not least because he moved the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which was seen as a fairly provocative move. I expect that Joe Biden will take a much more moderate stance on Israel-Palestine relations. And actually,
he's not going to move the embassy back again, is he? He can't reverse everything that Trump did.
I suspect he'll think that, that decision has now been made, but he will have to compensate for it. He'll have to make up to the other side, as it were, and show that he's going to be even-handed about this. So, one of the things, regardless of whether or not he has control of the Senate, one of the things he can do is control international policy. He has that power as president. And I would be very surprised if we didn't start to hear some more about, two-state solution. And I mean, I don't know whether we'll end up having more peace talks on the White House lawn like we've seen in previous administrations, but I'd imagine it'd be quite high at the top of his agenda, and he'd be taking quite a much less belligerent stance on it all than Donald Trump has.
Yeah, well, it'll be a pleasant surprise anyway, won't it? Be a nice change. Now, keep asking us your questions. Keep asking us whatever's on your mind, and we're going to try and answer them. Get into the comments and ask them, and we're going to pick them out and get them up here for you. Now, if you remember our next story, if you remember about a year ago, thousands of people had their homes destroyed by really terrible, almost once in a lifetime winter floods that had happened for about the fourth or fifth time in their lifetimes. Now, as you'll see on the Mirror's page 21 today, it's still talking about these areas in Doncaster, Fish Lake, places like that. Now, Boris Johnson rushed to meet them and be photographed sweeping out their kitchen floors just before the election last year, and he promised them cash to help rebuild. Now, a year on, dozens of families, it turns out, in Doncaster are still in temporary accommodation. They're arguing over every single penny with insurance companies who are, understandably perhaps, trying to limit their losses, but are arguing about whether they should pay for carpets. They're offering 30 grand when the quote for the building work is 50 grand. Apart from the fact that Boris has not been back to these places and has appeared to have completely forgotten about this part of the country, Pippa, doesn't this show that there's a case for almost like a national insurance scheme with payouts from the government rather than from a private company? Because it's in the government's interest to rebuild. It's not in a private company's interest, is it?
Yeah, and I mean, what the government, what any government it does when it comes to flood defences and investment in sort of, the environmental infrastructure, is sort of focus on that side of thing rather than helping out families whose homes have been lost and lives have been stricken. But and there was a certain amount of cash support, but you could argue, so I'm sure these families would argue that it wasn't sufficient. I would suggest that actually what the government needs to do is make sure that the insurance companies pay out, and whether that means sort of like special provisions in legislation over sort of act of gods, and obviously there's sort of various caveats in legislation, aren't there, for things like flooding, whether there's sort of like some sort of exceptional circumstance proviso that they can impose on insurance companies. I think they need to be tougher with them as well, because it does look like it's these businesses which are dragging their feet. Obviously there has to be public support there too, but I think it's kind of up for debate whether that is directly, I mean, obviously emergency payment should potentially go straight to people whose homes have been damaged, but longer term in terms of rebuilding, is it the responsibility of the government? Probably their focus and their money, our money, should be going on flood defences and the bigger picture stuff about climate change, which obviously plays a factor when it comes to rising sea levels and sort of the increase in flooding. But it is very striking, isn't it? I mean, Susie, you mentioned that before the election, Boris Johnson was out there slopping up water from shop floors, and he was really criticised when he didn't go back to those areas when flooding in January and February. He claimed at the time that it was because the emergency services said that he would be a hindrance, maybe because they thought that some of the local people wouldn't appreciate him being there. But regardless, it did very much look like political opportunism when he went the first time and not the second. And there'll be many thousands of people in places like Fish Lake, and mentioned in all the families mentioned in the paper today, and in other parts of the UK, who have suffered from flooding and will be feeling that the promises haven't been delivered on, and the government really needs to do something about that.
Exactly. And, this is a government that is quite happy to just ring someone up and say, would you like a PPE contract? And just have their taxman sit down with a big corporation and agree a sweetheart deal about how much tax they're not going to pay this year. There's no reason that Boris Johnson or someone in his administration can't ring up the bosses of the insurance companies and go, you're going to pay out now, aren't you? Otherwise, you will be legislated against. It takes 5 minutes. And there are so many thousands of people who would thank Boris Johnson for it, that it's a political absolute win. There's no reason for not doing it, I wouldn't have thought, politically. How is it possibly harmful to tell the insurance companies, pay out?
Well, they don't. I mean, despite some of the stuff that we're seeing, obviously, in recent times handling with COVID, this is a government, a Tory administration that doesn't like to intervene. It's a hands-off approach, laissez-faire approach to business, prefers just the market to continue in its own way. and survival of the fittest almost. But when it comes to people's lives, I think exceptions need to be made. And Boris Johnson has said a lot about caring about people's lives and the government being there to support them as a safety net and so on. He really means it. This could potentially be an area where he could show that. And it wouldn't, before they even get to the point of legislating, you could just, like you say, pick up the phone to some of the big businesses and make clear to them that they think that they need to, the big insurance companies, that they need to do more. I mean, their profits are not poor at the moment. I mean, they're one of the sectors which is doing really well, regardless of everything that's going on globally. And really, I think that they should be expected to pull their weight as well.
Exactly. And remember, if you read the paper today, which you should go out and buy and read this piece, it's absolutely eye-opening. There's a woman in there who's tried to commit suicide over the arguments about rebuilding her house. There are people whose relationships have broken up. There are children living in temporary accommodation whose schoolwork is going to suffer and whose life chances are going to suffer as a result. It's in everybody's interest as a nation that this is resolved in some way. Now, John asks, given Johnson's done another U-turn on school meals, I think it's technically a donut he's done now, John. How are Tory MPs who have publicly defended letting kids going hungry feeling now? Are they less likely to support the unpopular policies in the media in future? Because Boris Johnson whipped his MPs to vote against free school meals and then caved in for the school meals. They must be feeling betrayed, don't they, Pippa?
Well, there's a lot of grumblings, but this isn't the first time. And it's a great question, John, because this is probably, the sixth or seventh example of a moment where the government has forced their troops, their MPs, to go out and defend what some of them privately regard as sort of, an unpopular policy, not the way forward, and have forced them onto the airwaves to defend it, and not just cabinet ministers, backbenchers too. I mean, the Tory MPs that voted against this Labour plan for free school meal provision to be extended got a huge amount of grief for doing so. Huge amount of criticism. We named them all on the front page, and they were very much on the back foot, and a lot of them were extremely uncomfortable with being put in that position, but felt that because they had been instructed to from the top, they had the backing of Number 10, that they should do it. And there have been countless other examples of where that's been the case. And then the government pulls the rug away from underneath their feet. And honestly, the anger is palpable. There are Tory MPs who are fuming and feel that they're being done over by Number 10. There's a huge amount of criticism. There's almost like this schism between the backbench Tory MPs and the Number 10 operation, who are frankly very dismissive, some of them, about the MPs, regard them as sort of cannon fodder to go through the lobbies. They've got this big majority, so they can always get through what they want to do, but don't seem to sort of take seriously any of their own proposals, interventions. They're aren't really listening to them. Boris Johnson's faced a lot of criticism for not reaching out and speaking to MPs. I mean, he's the other area where this is bubbling up is, of course, with the lockdown, which has been imposed. Very many Tory MPs are very unhappy about that, and he did do a bit of outreach on that one because he recognised it was potentially a political firework that could really cause damage to him. Last week he was meeting Tory MPs, or well, either by Zoom or in his office in the House of Commons. But they're feeling really neglected. They need to be shown a bit of love at the moment because they're feeling that Number 10's going off and doing its own thing, often handling the communication side of things, whether it's COVID or flooding or free school meals, really poorly, and that they're being left to pick up the pieces and to sort of be the front for it all, and getting obviously a lot of grief from their constituents. So, I think there's going to have to be some love bombing of the Tory backbenchers by Number 10 soon, else those private grumblings are going to become a lot more public.
Yeah, well, if Boris Johnson's good at anything, it's charming someone he's just betrayed, isn't it? Louise asks, why are all the big businesses still open, but people with small businesses trying to earn a living are all focused to close, are all being told to close? I think you're talking about independent shops shutting down while some of the big chains are open. Pippa, do you know the answer to this question?
Well, it's a problem, isn't it? Because there's the difference between, as the government sees it, essential and non-essential retail. So lots of small shops which sell food or other goods which are regarded as essential are allowed to stay open. Of course, that primarily means that the big supermarkets can as well. And that's really difficult for already struggling smaller businesses because the supermarkets have a huge amount of clout and power and wealth and dominate the market at the best of times. What small businesses can do now is do click and collect. So if you run a clothes shop or a jewellery shop or something like that and you're worried about your takings up to Christmas, then you can do click and collect. If you've got a website, people can still buy things and then come and pick them up. But yes, it's really difficult for many small businesses. And if you haven't already, then do try and tap into the government support that's available because there is some there. And we just got to hope that the virus the cases have been sort of got on top enough within 4 weeks for there to be some sort of degree of reopening in the run up to Christmas, which of course we appreciate is sort of one of the most lucrative time of the year for many small businesses. But it's very, very worrying, and the government potentially isn't doing enough to support small firms, which risk go under, millions of jobs potentially going to be lost, livelihoods ruined, and it's a very, very tough time. So my heart, I absolutely feel for people that are running small businesses and are struggling to cope with all of this.
Yeah, part of Louise's question might be that smaller independent businesses are more likely to be less essential stuff because they're trying to find a gap in the market, whereas the obvious gaps in the market, the essential stuff, I think that are filled by big business because they've been there for a very long time because it's so vital. Now, keep asking us your questions. We're going to get around to as many of them as we can. But finally, we want to talk about this Sunday. Now, Britain is not going to let a pandemic get in the way of tradition, and certainly not important traditions. Remembrance Sunday happened yesterday, and we saw people responding to the Mirror's campaign for people to come out on their doorsteps at 11 a.m. We had the royals a good act of remembrance, as it were, still vital and important, even more than a century after the war ended. And even though it's about remembering the dead, it does sort of show, that life goes on in some way, doesn't it, Pippa? This is all going to end, and there are going to be other things that we still need to remember during all this.
Yeah, and I think for me anyway, personally, some of the most moving moments of the last 6 months during this really sort of difficult, tumultuous time that we're all living through have been when people have gathered in their communities on their doorsteps and done things like applaud the NHS, or when we had the VDA and I stood in my front garden with a glass of bubbles, and the kids one of my kids played God Save the Queen on his trombone bit badly. I'm not sure the neighbours appreciated that, but anyway, but everybody came together, and the same was true on Remembrance Sunday. That obviously, because of coronavirus crisis, for the first time, the memorial event at the Cenotaph was closed to the public, and lots of events around the country weren't able to happen. Small gatherings with small numbers happened outside in some places, but tricky to do anything bigger. So, we at the Mirror thought it was a great idea to try and encourage everybody to come out and stand on their doorsteps and have a sort of a more community-led memorial. And it's been brilliant, but the response to that was fantastic. So many people did it up and down the country. Politicians got behind it. The military leaders got behind it. Sports stars and celebrities got behind it. And, you can see all that in the paper today. And it really felt like a moment that, regardless of all the sort of the difficulties or the barriers in the way of people coming out and remembering, they still managed to do it from our doorstep. It's a great picture there, isn't it? Pride on the home front. And that was replicated up and down the land. And it's, I felt really proud that people were coming out and doing that. And, there will be more moments, I'm sure, of the winter where we sort of as a nation collectively remember or applaud or come together to in some way commemorate or mark an occasion or groups of people. We're not out of the woods yet with coronavirus, but it has, for me, been one of the ways that has most felt sort of, I've been sort of tied into my community, and it's been very sort of, in what is often a very solitary time, all stuck in our own homes, a really nice way of coming together with other people and marking an occasion.
Yeah, and there's been lots of people are quite cross that I have seen some people, perhaps the expected ones, who are cross that the veterans weren't there and the Cenotaph Memorial was altered from what we're used to it being. But I think it showed a great deal of care for our oldest and most frail and vulnerable people that we wanted to protect, because the people who are going to be at the Cenotaph are some of the sickest and some of the oldest people in the country who wanted to be there, but we're protecting them still. And that's still vital for the vast majority of people in the country, and despite all the anti-maskers and despite all the anger we have knocking around. Now, Caroline Peoples asked, what lockdown? I'm still working. I've seen the place as busy as normal. People are letting their kids out. Yes, Caroline, and this is a point I've made several times. This lockdown is not like the last one because, as Pippa's already mentioned, businesses are now set up for things like click and collect and takeaway that they weren't doing the first time round. They are more set up for web orders and things like that. Us as individuals, we have our yeast now, we have our sourdough recipes, and we know what we're up to. There are children still going to school. There are a lot of businesses still open, and surely the economic and social impact of this lockdown despite the fact it's supposed to be shorter, should be lessened or ameliorated to some extent, because lots of people are still going to work. I see out here, I live in a rural area, but the roads outside are just as busy as they were the week before lockdown, whereas during the proper lockdown earlier in the year, it was dead as a dodo and there was no one moving anywhere. It's not the lockdown we were being warned about, is it, Pippa, really?
No, and for me, the biggest issue, the biggest sort of difference is schools. Because that means that at certain times of the day there are people on the pavements and on the streets, and the buses are full. Took two of my three kids to school this morning. One goes on his own, and it's no different from any other time. So I think that exactly like you say, Susie, the impact in terms of the getting on top of the virus will not be as pronounced. I think that the one key area where I know that the government are worried is compliance, because on the one hand you've got all these rules which aren't quite as strict. There's sort of more caveats to them as there were before, but there's also definitely a lot of lockdown fatigue, and we've all seen it in our lives. People who in the last week or so, people who are clearly not abiding by the rules, and even before that, huge swathes of the country have been under effectively tier 3 lockdowns for months, and people are fed up with it. And part of that is just a natural human reaction, I think, to feeling that your personal freedoms are being eroded. But it's also to do with government's handling of the whole thing, and sort of the faith or lack of faith that people have in their ability to do things like get the test and trace system up and running. We were all told, you do your bit in the first lockdown, you stay at home, and we, the government, will do our bit. We'll get contact tracing operating, and that will help us get on top of this. And then that didn't happen over the summer, so a lot of people, I imagine, are kind of thinking, well, why should I bother? And then there's been high profile examples. Obviously we did the Dominic Cummings story of senior government figures flouting the rules themselves, the whole sort of one rule for them and one rule for everyone else. Nobody's suggesting it's easy for government in these unprecedented times, but you know what, we're more than 6 months in now, 7-8 months into this thing, and I think people were expecting a bit more. So there's definitely a problem with compliance, and the government are really worried about that. But I also think that they need to be really careful not just to blame the public for that. We all need to play our part, of course, but the government also needs to play its part.
Exactly. You can't be a government if you're not governing and people aren't following your rules. And it's quite a resentful sort of lockdown, it feels like, this time. But as we've just seen in America, things can change. Things can change narrowly, sometimes by a 48 to 52 majority, but things can change, and nothing is ever forever. Things always alter, nothing new under the sun. Thank you for watching, everybody. Thank you for joining me, Pippa, and explaining some of this stuff to us. I hope that the rest of the week is going to be positive and happy and cheery for you. And remember, part of the reason we're all fed up is because the weather's rubbish. So get yourself one of those little seasonal affective disorder lamps and cheer up, everybody. Spring will be soon. Christmas is going to be first. It'll be okay. Thanks for popping in. See you soon.